Anjeanette Roberts, thank you for joining me for this conversation. It's great to sit down and chat with you.
Matt, I'm really looking forward to it. I'm really grateful for your invitation.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this as well because you might just be the smartest person I've ever talked to.
I doubt
You
that, and I certainly hope not.
well, tell us a little bit about yourself, the things that you study, your background, and all of that. Tell us who you are.
Okay, well, I am a research scientist slash Christian apologist, perhaps. Although I like to use the language of I'm an advocate for Christian faith in the public arena. So, but my background is in chemistry as an undergrad, and then graduate school in molecular and cell biology. And then I did a lot of research in viruses and how viruses cause disease and how to prevent viral disease through the use of prophylaxis, medicines that you can take to help alleviate symptoms, and also through vaccine development. And so I did several years of research in those fields. I did teaching in the Department of Microbiology at the University of Virginia, and then I've done some science-faith interface positions with the Rivendell Institute at Yale. I did that for 15 months. And then I worked for an organization called Reasons to Believe here in Southern California for a few years. And for the past 8 months today, or 3 days ago, I've been working for the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, following sort of in the footsteps of Einstein, maybe. No, I don't know. Yeah, but I'm delighted. I'm delighted to speak with you, and I've been praying for the folks at St. Mark's and the people who listen to your podcast. So I'm looking forward to the questions that we discussed today.
Oh man, me too. So I want to start with kind of the big thing, which is that there is in our culture today this perceived divide between like the world of science and reason and the world of faith and spirituality, like and these two things just can't coexist, right? But I know that part of your specialty is living in both of these worlds and helping people kind of reconcile that perceived gap between them. So talk to us a little bit about that. Is there a gap between being a person of science and a person of faith? Are they incompatible?
Yeah. Oh, Matt, I didn't even have that concept challenged in my life until graduate student, when a Chinese national graduate student who was at the same university I was at for grad school said, how can you be serious about your science and believe in God? Prior to graduate school and that first sort of encounter with this skeptical idea that those two things can't coincide, for me, God and science were flip sides of the same coin, which is how to understand what's true about reality and true about who I am. And God was an encounter that I had through Jesus and faith in Jesus and Jesus seeking me out at the age of 12. And my love for science maybe precedes that a little bit because I kind of fell in love with Star Trek at a very early age. And then I had a great science teacher in 12th grade. And all truth is God's truth. And so science to me was a way to explore the truth about the natural world around me, and the scripture and the person of Jesus and the work of the Holy Spirit was a way to discover what's true about why we're here and who we are and what our purpose is. And so to me, they were both elements of navigating life in this sort of seeking after what's true.
And those questions of who we are, why we're here, and what our purpose in life is, I mean, those are questions that science can't answer for us, right?
That's right, they can't. So science is really about interrogating the natural world to finding out like causal mechanisms for why things happen the way that they happen. But science can't tell us sort of why anything is here to begin with. Nature itself needs an explanation, but science also can only answer sort of natural-based mechanistic type questions. It can't answer questions that are at the boundary, questions that are raised by philosophical or theological reflections, like even what does it mean to be alive, let alone what is the purpose in life? So what does it mean to be alive? Scientists wrestle with what defines life. We recognize it when we see it, but a really clear definition of what life is really difficult.
Does science disprove the reality of God in any way.
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think everywhere you look, honestly, this is one of my champion calls. Anywhere you look, you see evidence for God. Whether number one, it's because of the complexity and diversity and interdependence of all of creation. And so this idea that this sort of somewhat outdated, but maybe people will be surprised that I say that, Darwinian concept of sort of gradual change over eons of time that develop in complexity doesn't come close to explaining how we have these extremely intricate, interrelated systems. And that's true whether you look at a cell. It's true whether you look at, a cell is not simple, even though it's the simplest form of life. It's true if you look at Earth and its ecosystems. And it's true if you look at the universe and sort of like the Goldilocks factor. I don't know if you're familiar with that, sort of Earth being in the exact right place for under the exact right conditions to sustain life. And not only that, it's in the exact right place, not just to sustain life, but that life like ours, intelligent human life, can actually explore and discover the intricacies and the complexity of the universe. And those things just open up these huge areas of philosophical and theological reflection. Like, why is it this way? And what I've learned most recently in my own spiritual formation, and by most recently, I mean really over the last year, God's been showing me that as I look out on creation and the diversity that I see in creation, I mean, even talking about the things that grow in my backyard or things that fly through the air, let alone going to the grocery store and just looking at the people around me, even though I can only see what's showing from behind their masks. I mean, there's diversity everywhere we look. And that diversity is something that delights God's heart. I mean, if it weren't so, creation wouldn't be so beautiful and diverse, right? It's this way for a purpose. And so God's really showing me that in this diversity and complexity, diversity within a cell, diversity within our own bodies as to what our different cells are doing, diversity in the creation that we can observe around us, and diversity in the things that we encounter in the cosmos. It's a reflection that God loves diversity. And I am drawn to the idea that none of us who follow Christ are meant to look the same. That each one of us is called in our unique situation in life, with our unique giftings, with our unique desires, into an intimate relationship with God, to be conformed into the image of his Son for the sake of ourselves and for the sake of the world. And the world doesn't just mean the person that I encounter on the street, who might be very different and very diversely different than I am, but for our world in the sense of we're meant to be stewards. We're meant to be lovers of our fellow human beings, and we're meant to be stewards of God's good creation. And so those are the things that I've been learning. Those are the things that science has been showing me, that I've been reflecting on most deeply recently. And I'm excited about that, because it relieves a lot of tension that my Christianity has to look like anybody else's. You know, I just have to faithfully follow Christ and let Christ, through the power of the Holy Spirit, lead me into deeper union with him and deeper conformity into his image. So
is it safe to say then that your study and your work in science has actually served to deepen and strengthen and enrich your faith? Can science do that in the context of faith?
It absolutely can. And I think that it does it not just for me, but for many people that I've encountered who are sort of at the interface of science and Christian faith. You know, whether it's people at Reasons to Believe or BioLogos or the Faraday Institute for Science and Christianity, which is in the UK. There's another organization called Peaceful Science. There's the Discovery Organization or Institute. All of these people are faithfully trying to walk out what does it mean that God is real, and that biblical Christianity is true, and that science is a way that we can study what God's given us.
So tell me more about being a molecular biologist.
Yeah.
What's I was an arts major in college, not a science guy. I was a sing and dance guy. So So I don't know
Life
much.
is better because of people like you.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate it. I
Yeah.
appreciate it. So
No,
a molecular biologist, what do you study?
Molecular biologists, we study the things that you can't see. So people will hear that I'm a scientist and they'll hear molecular biologist and they'll ask me questions about flowers and trees. And I'm like, no, you've got this entirely wrong. If you can see it with the naked eye, I know very little about it. But I understand the things that are sort of at the micro level or even smaller than that, the molecular level. And so what are the components of a cell? How does a cell work? Like what are the intricate systems in a cell? Or the diverse kinds of cells that we have. How do viruses work in a human body? What are the components of a virus? I actually studied the original SARS virus. So when this SARS virus came around, a lot of people found out about that. And I was answering a lot of questions about COVID and about SARS. And so those are the kinds of things that we study. We study what are the elements of viruses, the elements of cells, even really like how does DNA express and get controlled? What does that mean, express? So DNA makes RNA, makes proteins. That's sort of the mantra of molecular biology. But DNA is very complex. RNAs are very complex. And you add complexity upon complexity in a cell, you have hundreds of thousands of different components. And from my perspective, pretty much all of those things are needed at one point in time or another. And so there's a lot of redundancy built in. There's a lot of fail-safe mechanisms. These types of things are things that we discover as molecular biologists. And these are the things that really build the bridge for me to see that, wow, it's just beautiful how God has made things so complex and so finely tuned to give us a creation where we can thrive and know him, and where we're sometimes challenged, right? But that the challenges are actually what invite us into spiritual formation and to seeking help from one another and from God. So yeah, molecular biologists, we study DNA, cellular systems. It depends on sort of the flavor of the day or the molecular biologist. They may study immunology, they may study viruses, they may study other aspects of human biology or plant biology, or just the bugs that are around us in the ecosystem. So kind of an all-encompassing foundational study of all those things.
So share with us something that you've witnessed, you've learned in your work as a molecular biologist that has made you just have a jaw-dropping moment of awe for God, of what he's made. So, something you discovered that you're like, whoa, this just makes my awe for God and his creation just go through the roof.
There are a lot, but this is sort of the pinnacle example that I love to give. So up until about, I don't know, maybe 40, 50 years ago, maybe not quite that long ago, we always thought that bacteria and viruses were bad. And that was really because of our limited ability to interrogate what bacteria and viruses were doing. And so, we would see somebody sick, we would see a plant that was sick, an animal that was sick, and we would ask, why is the person, the plant, the animal sick? And we would find, oh, it's bacteria. Oh, it's viruses. But we also knew that some bacteria had good functions, like our microbiomes, the bacteria in our guts that actually help process nutrients. So science kind of started to uncover that bacteria are good. But most people, especially maybe now because of the pandemic, they're like, viruses, this can't be an element of God's goodness, right? There can't be really a good God if we have pandemics like this. But the reality is that bacteria are single cell organisms that are champions of reproducing themselves and champions of adapting to different changes in the environment. And the reason they have that ability to adapt is because at a molecular level, the molecular biologist in me, they can swap genetic information. They're very promiscuous about swapping genetic information. And they're single cells. So if a single cell picks up a right piece of DNA, from another cell that was previously in that environment, that new cell can now take on some of that characteristics, and it can cause it to adapt to a new environment. So if you think about it, if you kind of step back from the intricacies of those details and think about it at a big scale, the oldest life on Earth, from our observations of fossil records and from our best scientific theories, the oldest life on Earth was single cellular life. And single cellular life, the bacteria, right? They are what's known as primary producers. I don't know if you remember that from any of your biology classes, but a primary producer can take sunlight and water and inorganic substances, inorganic meaning sort of like minerals and stuff that's not living, and it can take those three components and it can convert it into organic material. And that organic material is the primary source of all of sort of the food that provides for life on planet Earth. And so you have these masters of replication, these masters of adaptation that are primary producers. And so from a step back, big picture question, it's like, if that's what was around at the very, very beginning, why isn't that all that's here? Masters of replication, masters of adaptation. Why is there any other life here? Like, why isn't Earth just one big giant ball of bacteria floating through space? And the answer is, and this really blew my mind, and I didn't discover this until about 6 years ago, this sort of balance between viruses and bacteria. So viruses are everywhere. The vast majority of them are not doing anything harmful. In fact, the vast majority of them are keeping the bacterial population on planet Earth in check. So viruses, unlike bacteria, can't reproduce on their own. They have to have a living cell in order to make more virus. And so why isn't Earth overrun with bacteria? Because the vast majority of viruses on planet Earth are infecting bacteria and keeping the bacterial population in check. And so that opens up ecological space for other forms of life to exist. And so even at the foundational level of life on planet Earth, there is a finely tuned system, if you will, of checks and balances, where we have this organism that master reproduction and adaptation that's necessary for other life, but is kept in control by something at a molecular level that can't reproduce itself. And so the two are balanced in numbers. And that balance is really foundational for all of life on planet Earth. So that's like the most mind-boggling thing to me that I've encountered, where I was just like, wow, this is crazy. I mean, I fell in love with the curiosity behind like what's a virus way back in college. Used to get all kinds of respiratory infections, and I'd go to the doctor and the doctor would be like, yeah, I can't do anything about it. It's a virus. And so I was just like, what are these viruses doing? And so year after year after year, decade after decade, if you will, of studying viruses only in the context of disease made me think viruses aren't so good. But we can now go out and pick up a sugar cube's worth of dirt or a sugar cube's worth of ocean water. And if we measure the genetic information in that dirt or water, what we find is that there are hundreds of thousands of particles of viruses. So viruses are all around us. And the question then becomes, well, why? Or what, for what purpose, right? What are they doing? And what we're discovering is they're keeping the bacteria in check. So, wow. Hallelujah. What a cool observation, right? All of creation really is declaring the glory of God, and not just the glory of God, but the goodness of God and God's provision. So,
well, that delicate balance that you describe is as you said, kind of mind blowing, but it leads me to this place where, I've often been, as I look at the world as a layman, and I think, it for me, it takes more faith. It would take more faith to believe that that delicate balance you just described is accidental, right?
Right.
Than designed, right? Because nowhere else do we observe that kind of intricacy and complexity and kind of intention that just happens out of nothing, right?
Right, right. Now you live in Houston, and Houston's a pretty big city. So is
Yeah.
LA. I live outside of LA. And I was flying out of LAX one night, and I looked down at the city, and it was lit up, and you could see all kinds of different like hubs and motion and cars and factories and houses. And I looked down at it, and as I was looking down at it, all of a sudden I realized, wow, do you know that even LA, this mammoth metropolis that is full of activity, is simpler in the number of components and the way that they interact than a single cell is at a molecular level. And so even thinking about that, I echo your observation that, you know, science at a molecular level can open up new vistas of awe and wonder, but you don't have to be a molecular biologist to be in awe and wonder of the balance. You can see it in creation. And I think that's why the psalmist reminds us to reflect on animals, or maybe the Proverbs also, or Job, call us to reflect on ants or on birds. And as we observe nature around us, I think that's actually something we suffer in a sort of urbanized society, is we don't reflect on nature enough. But as we're invited to reflect on nature, I think we see that and we discover, wow, this is not just beautiful, it's not just diverse, but it's interrelated in a way that's screams of purposefulness. So, yeah.
How does our development of this the vaccines to fight COVID, how does that in your mind, and I'm going to start with an assumption here, but how does that in your mind also declare the glory and goodness of God?
Well, okay, so I wish I had this verse memorized, but there's a verse that says it's the glory of God to sort of hide things, and the glory of kings to discover them. And I love to take that verse when I have it written down in front of me and replace the word kings with scientists, because I think kings don't really do anything, right? They tell other people what to do. But yeah, so I think that, you know, as we look deep into these things, we see this balance that invites even deeper interrogation and deeper discovery. So when I think of like the task before us as scientists, or even as human beings, when we think we've understood something completely, we're almost certainly wrong. That there's always something deeper to discover. And it's kind of God's invitation to say, look, there is infinite potential for discovery. And if you take the time to engage, to look deeper into how these things are related, whether it's in human behavior and relationships, or at a cellular level or a microbe level, each of those discoveries can tell us something about God's heart and about God's purpose. And I think each of those discoveries is something that invites us to wonder, and or if we're already a Christian or already a believer in a loving God that created the world around us, they lead us to worship. They lead us to praise, because we realize that God not only wants us to seek truth, but he actually wants us to enjoy discovering truth. So I hope that answered your question. I realized as I was talking that I had maybe forgotten what your question was, but.
Well, I think, so the development of this COVID vaccine is.
Oh, the vaccine.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah,
no,
I
you're
was
good. You're
way
good.
off target. So the way that I look at it is, as we discover things about viruses, we as scientists discover things about viruses, it allows us to manipulate the things that we've learned in order to use them to advance what I consider stewardship, right? And the goals: compassion for our human neighbor, love for our human neighbor, so alleviating disease, or care of creation. And so we, through the study of cells, through the study of viruses, we learn how diseases are caused, and we learn how to interrupt the disease process. And the only way we can interrupt the disease process is because God has already given us something to build on, the immune system, right? And so the immune system is sort of our inbuilt God-given protection. And we as scientists discover how the immune system works, how viruses work, how the disease is caused. And so we can develop vaccines or drugs that interrupt or prime the immune system to do a better job that it wouldn't normally do, and it can help protect us. So I see that type of work as twofold. It's discovery, but then it's compassionate implementation of what we've learned to benefit humanity.
Yeah, it's
a better answer?
Oh, absolutely. It's great. I mean, to me, as I see what we as a human community have had to accomplish in the last year, I see two things. I see, as humans are a part of creation too, and so as we are able to harness science and other disciplines to create something that helps our neighbor, right, and utilizes the resources of this world, we are, as a member of creation, declaring the complexity and the beauty and the awesomeness of God. But then also we're being faithful to what Christians would call that creation mandate, which is to harness the world and use it in a way that blesses the world, honors God, and loves our neighbor. It's a great example of that. And it's part of how we bear the image of God, because we're one, I would think we're probably the only really part of creation that really can do the creative work that God also does,
That's absolutely right. I'm glad you brought that point up. It's definitely one of the ways that we demonstrate not just co-regency with God and how we manage creation, but really how we mirror an aspect of who God is in our creativeness. And then we mirror the change in our own hearts that's brought about by discovering the love of God for us in Jesus, by mirroring Jesus' actions and implementing in ways that benefits others, even taking on some personal risks, right? So some people may be afraid of the vaccine, but hopefully our love and compassion for the vulnerable around us would motivate us to go ahead and take advantage of this thing that God has enabled us to discover and develop for our benefit.
So on that point of the fact that there are some who are really hesitant to take the vaccine and for various reasons, certainly we're not here to have this conversation to promote anything, because vaccines have been politicized, I think probably wrongly, but just from a standpoint of a person of science and a person of faith, in general, how should we from your perspective view these vaccines that have been developed to help us fight COVID?
Yeah, I think that, I want to address people's fears and concerns first and foremost in response to that question that you asked, because I don't want anybody to hear me say, oh, that's totally ridiculous, right? Like, people shouldn't be afraid. The reality is that whenever you do anything like a vaccination, it's a medical procedure. And medical procedures always come with some element of risk. But now, having said that, there will never be a risk-free medical intervention. But scientists and doctors and clinicians and pharmaceutical companies all work together to try and ascertain how safe these vaccines are for the vast majority of people. And as you'll know, they've already paused a couple of vaccines, right? The AstraZeneca, the Johnson & Johnson ones, they got paused. People think, see, this is why we shouldn't be taking vaccines. They're dangerous. No, people should look at that and say, see, we're doing what we need to do. When we think something might have a safety issue, we stop using it. But we've had over 200 million people vaccinated, and there have been very small numbers associated with any type of that kind of severe side effect. And so the reality is that these vaccines are incredibly safe for the vast majority of people who will be vaccinated. But we also know, okay, maybe there are some confounding factors that are associated with more adverse reactions to the vaccine. We're discovering those the more people that get vaccinated, right? Smaller and smaller numbers of people, the more people get vaccinated, those numbers will start to become recognizable, right? They'll rise to the level where we're like, oh, well, maybe there's another vulnerable population. That's part of the learning process. And, there's just some risk associated with learning when it comes to medicine and science and life in general. There's some risk associated with learning. And so we need to not ever discount someone's experience that's had a negative reaction to a vaccine. That's not Christ-like to discount their experience. We need to come alongside them. We need to show compassion. We need to help walk through whatever challenges they're facing together. That's one of our deepest responsibilities, is to be compassionate. But it's also to speak truth about the safety and the efficacy of the vaccines, and to speak truth about the fact that there are known vulnerable populations that can't receive the vaccine. And so then the question becomes, do you, as an individual who values other people's lives and who values showing the love of Christ to everyone, regardless of who they are, do you take on a minimal amount of risk for the sake of benefiting others at a greater level? And I think there, the choice is also biblically clear if we're following Christ. We love at cost to ourselves, right? We don't just love when it's convenient. We don't just love when it's safe. That's not the kind of love that Christ imaged for us, right? He imaged a love that takes on risk and that takes on suffering. So,
absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for that. Well, what is you mentioned that you worked on developing resources to fight the first kind of SARS outbreak.
yes.
And so you have hands-on experience in this work. What's different about this vaccine than previous vaccines?
About this vaccine. There's a lot different about this vaccine. And wow, I wish we could actually talk a little bit more about vaccines, and I don't want to go off on another long answer like I just gave you to the previous questions. But so the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines are new platforms. And what I mean by that is the components in the vaccines are components that haven't been used in human populations before. And so that makes them even sort of, at least at a very superficial understanding level, maybe a bigger question mark in regard to risk. But everything that I've already said is true. They're proving to be very, very safe and very, very efficacious. And so the platforms that these vaccines are built on are using a piece of molecular components called RNA. And so it's not DNA and it's not proteins. It's that intermediate piece. It's the RNA. And so it's powerful because you don't have to go through the step of getting from DNA to RNA. DNA vaccines have not been very effective. Protein vaccines have been effective, and protein vaccines in the context of the virus that actually causes the disease are what a lot of our vaccines are based on. They're based on virus particles that have been inactivated or killed, if you want, or are weakened, right? So they've been weakened to the point where if you give that particular weakened virus to someone, it will trigger the immune system, but it won't trigger it severely enough to cause disease. And if it's killed or inactivated, it'll trigger the immune system without the possibility of causing virus-related disease, right? And so these Moderna and Pfizer vaccines aren't giving us protein. They're not giving us viruses in any form, weakened or inactivated, and they're not giving us DNA. They're giving us an intermediate molecule that when that molecule gets into our cells, it makes the proteins that are associated with the virus. And so the RNA is not very stable. It's one of the least stable molecules at a molecular biological level that we have. And so it has to be protected. And so that's part of the platform of the virus. It's encapsulating the RNA. And that encapsulated portion helps the RNA get into the cell. But once that encapsulated vaccine element comes in contact with the cell and the RNA is released into the cell, the RNA makes the proteins and then the RNA gets destroyed inside the cell. So there's nothing that's ending up in our genomes. There's nothing that's hanging out in our cells for a very long time. The RNA is getting in, it's making protein, it's being degraded, and the immune system's responding to the protein that was made. And so that's why we need a booster too, because one shot, not quite enough of a boost to get the immune system really charged. So do it once, let those proteins get made, let the immune system respond, let the immune system settle down a little bit. It's changing its profile a little bit, and then you hit it again. And the immune system comes back a little more quickly. That's why there's more reactions to the second dose than there is to the first. The immune system comes back a little bit more quickly, a little bit stronger, but that's good. It means the vaccine's working. And it means when you're toddling around 2 weeks later after your second dose and you encounter the virus, the immune system acts so quickly and so robustly that it doesn't get a chance to set up an infection and you're protected. So
that's incredible.
Good to go.
You made that so understandable. I really appreciate it. Again, as a non-science guy, I really appreciate that. So are people in the scientific community, and people who specifically who do the work that you do, are they? Is there a sense of awe that you have been able, that community has been able to accomplish this quickly?
Yes and no. Yeah, so we knew a lot about the virus type, and we knew a lot about the immune response to the virus type, the virus family, right? Because of the work that I and others did 18 years ago. And so we already knew which part of the virus was the most immunogenic. We already knew sort of what element of the immune system you wanted to stimulate to get good protective immunity. And so basically took that knowledge, sort of double checked it against this virus's characteristics. And then once we double checked it, it's like, yeah, we know the components we want. Take those components at a molecular level, plug them into these platforms that had been developed over time. The platforms hadn't been used in humans yet, but they were already developed. And so the fact that they were developed, coupled with the knowledge that we had from previous experience, implemented in the context of this particular virus, we got to potential vaccines much quicker than normal. Could it have been even quicker? Well, yes, but we would have had to have sort of sidestep some of the risk analysis. So I don't know if you're aware, but the Russians came out with a COVID vaccine very early on. And basically they took old technology, not the RNA platform technology of Pfizer and Moderna. They took old technology and they developed a vaccine based on past knowledge. And they're like, we've got it. And it's working in lab animals. And so we're going to put it in people. And huge risk, but big benefit. I mean, the Russians do good science when it comes to virology and when it comes to these types of molecular science discoveries and development. The Russians are some of the most competent scholars and scientists on the planet. And so the fact that they got lucky is kind of overstating it. I mean, they have experience, they have knowledge, they implemented it, they made good guesses, they made good decisions. And thankfully, for the people who have received that vaccine, they got it right. And what's stunning is that their vaccine is very much like the J&J vaccine, some differences, and very much like the AstraZeneca vaccine. And if you compare those three vaccines head to head, based on the data that we have, and a direct study comparing all three head to head hasn't been done, but based on the data we have for all three of those vaccines, if you compare the data and you believe the data, the Russians actually got it better than the Oxford AstraZeneca or the J&J vaccine. So yeah, there's old technology that still works pretty well, but new technology seems to be doing a better job. So
totally fascinating. So, AJ, back to
about stuff I could talk about all day long.
Well, it's front of mind for everybody, and the typical person like me who is a person of faith, not particularly astute in the sciences. taking the vaccine is an act of faith. It really is, because,
It is, but I can
you
tell
just got to
you
trust
that
people.
that faith is a more reasonable faith than thinking, oh, I'm probably going to be okay if I get the virus, right? Which is the alternative, right? If you don't have protective immunity, the alternative is you remain vulnerable to the virus. And so if you get the virus, the chances are we're learning more and more about what this virus does inside a person's body. And people are very different. Remember the diversity I talked about at the very beginning? That is true when it comes to your immune system and my immune system, and your physiology and my physiology. And it has nothing to do with the fact that you're a Houstonian and I live in California, or that you're a man and that I'm a woman. It has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with, we are all very different in our cellular immune physiological profiles of how we're susceptible to different diseases. I don't know if you've ever gotten the flu.
Yeah.
You have? Okay.
I have.
Well, I know people who have never gotten the flu, right? I know people, well, even just think about people in the pandemic, right? They're asymptomatic people, right? And so there are people who don't get symptoms, who have actual infection with this virus and they don't get symptoms. Other people get the virus and they end up on a ventilator in the hospital or worse, right? And so why is that true? Is it because the virus is different? No, probably not. The virus is, the differences in the virus strains or in the virus particles that are infecting different people are not that different. What's different is an individual's physiology. And so what you have to recognize too is that that diversity in our individual physiologies doesn't go away when it comes to being vaccinated either, right? And so let's not talk about the COVID vaccine for a moment. And that's really important that we're not talking about the COVID vaccine. If we talk about a different kind of vaccine, none of the COVID vaccines are this way, but if we talk about a different vaccine that's using a whole virus particle, but one that's weakened, right? Well, weakened in response, in regard to most people's immune response and most people's physiology. But let's say it's a virus like measles. Measles can infect and kill some people. Measles can infect and make some people sick. Measles can infect and cause very mild symptoms. But the virus isn't different, the people are different. And so if measles were to infect somebody who has an adverse reaction to a weakened vaccine, right? So this person wasn't infected with measles. This person just got a weakened form of measles in the vaccine, and they had a strong adverse reaction to the vaccine. If that individual had encountered the full strength wild type virus, chances are they would have been in that category of severe disease or death. And so even sort of, it comes back to the sort of the medical procedure associated with some risk. Even though there's risk associated with the medical procedure of getting a vaccine, that risk is still on an individual basis, probably magnitudes less than if that same individual would be exposed to the wild type virus, right? So that's something else that I don't think people understand or appreciate, because they don't understand sort of immune responses, they don't understand viral pathology, how viruses make people sick, and they don't understand how very different we can be at physiological levels. So
yeah. Absolutely.
Anyway, let's do you want to keep talking about viruses, or do you
well, I want to. This is fascinating, and I want to turn the conversation back as we begin to close. I want to turn the conversation back to just trying to help kind of the average person get this sense of awe and wonder over the world God's created, the bodies He's given us, the universe we live in, and I want to ask you another question that is in that vein. What is something that the typical person can see on a daily basis with their own eyes that, from a scientific perspective, is just unbelievable and awesome, but we tend to, as we go about our lives, like take it for granted?
So because we can't see bacteria with our naked eyes, I can't go there again, but we can't see trees, right?
Yeah.
And so trees are a little bit like bacteria in this respect. Every tree that you encounter is a primary producer also, because every tree does photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is taking sunlight and water and inorganic chemicals and turning them into organic foodstuffs. Well, the amazing thing about trees that is inexplicable if you just talk about trees in isolation in a sort of non-theistic or Darwinian perspective is that trees make way more organic foodstuffs than trees themselves actually need. And so, you know, if a tree were just trying to be a tree and survive, they wouldn't be as abundant in provision as they are. And yet they are. And so every tree that we see is sort of this testimony that it's like, wow, this tree is making way more than it needs. It's doing way more than it needs. Every tree, regardless of whether it produces fruit or not, right? So it's like trees are a testimony of God's abundance in creation. And so, you know, I love walking among the trees. And not only that, but the trees are actually really beneficial for you. They release these chemicals that are actually really good at stimulating elements of our physiology that's good for our health. And you also encounter sort of the free radicals that are associated with the oxygen that they're producing. Also really good. So go take a walk, bathe under the trees. Every tree you look at, I'm tempted to hug, I'm tempted to hug the trees I see, but I don't think that has anything to do with living on the West Coast. I was that way when I was growing up in Oklahoma. So, yeah.
That's great. It's okay to hug a tree now that we know, that God has put it here to produce way more than it needs to for our benefit, that's okay. All right. So
the rest of the living entities in creation, right? Not just the birds that are nesting.
Yeah. And not only can we walk among the trees, but, I think, part of what you have reminded me of in our conversation is that, I can also go to the Science Museum here in Houston and allow that as a person of faith to be a source of encouragement to me as a person of faith, just looking at the complexity and the beauty and the intention in this world. I should enter into a space like that with that kind of attitude, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Although you might need to be a little bit more cautious because you can go into those types of environments and you might get a little bit of philosophy thrown in for free, right? Sort of non-theistic philosophy thrown in for free.
Yeah.
So you have to keep your heart and your mind open to perhaps all of these things are actually really a reflection of the goodness of God. So.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I said I was going to end, but I've got one more question for you because I know you're such a
challenge of trying to whittle this down to whatever your 5 or 7 minutes.
Right. Well, one distinction that's been helpful to me, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, but one distinction that's been helpful to me as I've wrestled with, the professed disparity in our culture between science and faith is the distinction between science and what some have called scientism.
Sure.
Could you explain a little bit about that for those who are watching and listening?
I'm going to try and explain it in a way that I haven't before because I think it might be more interesting. I think I typically kind of get down in the weeds, but I love wearing t-shirts from Life is Good because I'm a person that kind of needs to be reminded that life is good because life seems so hard sometimes. But every time I put on a Life is Good shirt, I think not only is life good, but God's good. And I have one Life is Good t-shirt that says sort of there are 2 ways of looking at the universe or the world. I forget exactly what the words are. You can look at life as though everything is a miracle, or you can look at life as though nothing is a miracle. And so that really sort of sums up the second phrase, where you look at life as though nothing were a miracle. the view of scientism, where it's like the the natural order, nature, if you will, has a capacity from where we don't know in this particular narrative of scientism. We don't know where the capacity comes from, but it has a capacity where everything that exists and ever has existed can be boiled down to matter or energy, um, or the fundamental physical components of the universe. And that because that's true, because that's all that's real, that's all that's really real, there is no such thing as a supernatural or a metaphysical realm that's real. None of that's real. Then everything has a naturalistic, mechanistic, physical explanation. Uh, Even though the physical stuff of the universe doesn't really have an explanation. But given that that's here, given that that capacity is present, then everything about us has the ability to be described and understood fully and completely apart from any reference to any supernatural or any God or any metaphysical force. So scientism is, I don't really like that word, but it is a word that gets thrown around in apologetics for sure. It's just basically a way of saying, look, there are really two ways that you can view reality. One is reality is more than the physical matter, energy stuff. Or no, reality is only the physical energy material stuff, right? Those are your only two options, really. Now you may have sort of an epistemological, right, a way of understanding that says I can't really distinguish which one of those are true, right? Either one could be true. So that might make you sort of an agnostic, right? Yeah. But those other two options put you in one of two categories. Either you're a theist, somebody who believes in the supernatural and a creator, or you're a non-theist, someone who thinks that there is no such thing as the supernatural, only the material. So scientism is sort of the process of describing the things around us, including the things we discover in science, from that naturalistic only reality worldview.
Yeah, yeah, I love the way you define it, because what I've kind of heard you say is that when science becomes a worldview, your science has become something else. It's, science is a discipline, but then there are some who say that who turn their science into a way of not only describing and discovering what is, but also then using it as the lens through which you understand why things are and for what purpose they are, which is, as we talked about at the beginning, really isn't the point or purpose of science. It's good, and if you use science that way, it's just going to lead you to this place of, well, we're just materialist, right?
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. I don't know if you want resources to point people to, but I've contributed to a book called Thinking About Evolution. So if people are interested in sort of how this philosophical part overlaps with the science part, there's a couple of chapters in there that address that.
Great.
There's another one called Building Bridges, where I actually talk about, the goodness of viruses, keeping the viruses and the bacteria in check. So I've written a chapter in that book that talks about that. And then I've got some stuff out there that's free on YouTube, where I talk about God's purposes revealed in science and suffering. And so, I made one passing comment about how life can be challenging, but that challenge is really an invitation for spiritual formation, and an invitation for us to recognize our own need for other people and for God. So I think all of these elements are really important, that you can't really have these conversations about science and faith without thinking about the bigger questions like purpose and the character and the heart of God, and how all of these things sort of fit together in, let's go postmodern for a minute, a meta narrative, right? Yeah. To understand the world around us. So I don't think meta narratives are bad. I think we all have them. So,
Yeah, it's just a question of which one, right?
yeah.
Yeah, one of my professors in seminary, said, no one has a perspective from nowhere, right? Like everybody, you may think if you're, particularly you see this, I think with some kind of hyper materialists, right? Like they're the ones, because they're just in their mind looking at the evidence, that they have the perspective from nowhere, right? Like there's no bias, there's no blind sides. They have that unbiased view of things. But the reality is that everybody is standing on top of some story, some lived experience, some assumptions, right?
Yes.
And that's that's shaping how we see and understand the world.
Right.
It just is, yeah.
And very few people, at least in my experience, very few people think very deeply about that point that you just raised, right? So we sort of navigate our way through life sort of grossly unaware of what our own fundamental assumptions are.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Man, Anjeanette, I could talk to you for a very, very long time, because you
let's
have.
do it again sometime then, Matt.
Let's absolutely do it, because I've got a long list of other questions. But thank you for helping us get in touch with a sense of awe over what's happening in the world we can't see at a molecular level, and helping us also understand a bit more of what's happening with the vaccine and the virus we're all battling right now. So thank you so much for that.
You're welcome. And I hope I can also leave us with the concept that diversity is good, that it's actually at the heart of God. And it takes an extreme level of diversity to even begin to reflect an infinite and omnipotent God. So,
amen to that. Amen to that. Thank you so much. Thanks for being our guest here.
Thanks, man.